We are living through a moment that very few people expected, and even fewer are willing to talk about honestly. For decades, the public story has been simple and one directional: that men were the problem, that masculinity was a defect, and that society would somehow improve by correcting, reshaping, or removing men from the center of civilization. Now, the consequences of that belief system are impossible to ignore. What happens when the group that builds, maintains, protects, and funds a society is told they are unnecessary, unwanted, and harmful? What happens when they finally listen? Stay with me to the very end of this video, because what we are witnessing right now is not a trend, it is a turning point. Before we get into it, take a second to like the video, share it with someone who needs to hear this conversation, subscribe to the channel, and click the notification bell, and select all so you get every single Angry Guy video the moment it drops. It helps the channel more than you realize, and it makes sure you do not miss what is coming next. Also, make sure you check out Angry's Crypto Academy if you want to learn how to protect and safeguard your assets and grow your wealth. The Academy teaches you how to buy, sell, and trade crypto responsibly in a world where financial stability is becoming less certain by the year. The link is in the description, so go check it out now. And if you're enjoying these Angry Guy videos and want to show support, you can buy me Reggae Red Bull using the link in the description. It keeps the lights on and the content coming. Now, let us talk about what is really happening. We are witnessing something that mainstream voices are only now beginning to admit, often quietly and reluctantly. Modern society has inflicted long-term damage on men and boys through decades of messaging that frame them as broken versions of women, defective by default, and dangerous unless corrected. From classrooms to corporate training programs to media narratives, boys were told that their instincts were wrong, their competitiveness was unhealthy, their strength was suspicious, and their ambition needed to be restrained. Masculinity itself was treated as a flaw rather than a feature. And for a long time, men tried to adapt. They tried to apologize for existing. They tried to soften themselves to fit a world that increasingly had no place for them. But here is the part that was never acknowledged: men are not optional to civilization. Men pay roughly 80% of all taxes. Men make up the vast majority of military personnel, security forces, and policing. Men are the overwhelming majority of the workforce that builds and maintains infrastructure. Men dominate blue-collar labor, sanitation, construction, energy, transportation, and logistics. Men are the majority of truck drivers who keep the supply chain moving. When men stop showing up, things do not merely slow down, they begin to break. And when enough men walk away, systems do not collapse dramatically all at once. They quietly fail, one shortage, one delay, one safety issue at a time. That is exactly what we are seeing now. Entire industries are facing labor shortages that cannot be solved with slogans or advertising campaigns. Military recruitment numbers are collapsing. Infrastructure projects are delayed or abandoned. Tax revenue is shrinking as tens of millions of working age men have exited the workforce entirely. Over 50 million men are no longer participating in the traditional economic system, and the response from leadership has largely been confusion and denial. For decades, society told men they were not needed. Now society is shocked to discover that men believed it. This is not just a crisis for institutions, it is also a crisis for women, although that part of the story is far more uncomfortable to discuss. For generations, men acted as a buffer between women and the harsh realities of the world. Men built families, absorbed risk, and provided stability. But after decades of ideological messaging that prioritized career status and personal indulgence above long-term partnership and family building, many women now find themselves isolated, financially strained, and without a support structure. High levels of debt, unstable employment, and the absence of a reliable family unit have left many women facing a future they were never prepared for. The promise was independence and empowerment. The reality has been insecurity and uncertainty. At the same time, men were told to step back. They were told their presence was intrusive. Their attention was unwanted. Their leadership was oppressive, their role was outdated. And something unexpected happened. Instead of protesting endlessly, men listened, they withdrew, they stopped engaging, they stopped chasing approval from a society that clearly did not want them. And rather than collapsing, many men discovered something they had not been allowed to experience before: peace. For years, pressure was applied relentlessly. Every public space became hostile. Every interaction became a potential liability. Campaigns and social movements frame men as perpetual suspects, guilty until proven otherwise. Normal behavior was pathologized. Ordinary social interaction was scrutinized. Men learned that silence was safer than engagement. Distance was safer than connection. Withdrawal was safer than participation. So they adapted. They walked away from dating. They walked away from marriage. They walked away from institutions that offered responsibility without respect. What is rarely discussed is how thorough this withdrawal has been. Men are no longer approaching women in public spaces. Men are no longer volunteering emotional labor, financial support, or protection by default. Men are no longer investing in systems that treat them as expendable. They are choosing solitude, minimalism, and self direction. They are discovering that being alone is not the same as feeling lonely. Once the constant pressure is removed, once the expectations and accusations fade, many men report a level of calm they had never experienced before. This is not chaos for men, it is clarity. Men are pattern recognition machines by nature. When the incentives change, behavior changes. When effort produces punishment instead of reward, effort stops. Men have observed the outcomes of modern relationships, modern institutions, and modern expectations, and they have drawn conclusions based on observable reality rather than promises. They are no longer persuaded by narratives, they trust results. The result is what we are now seeing across society: fewer marriages, fewer children, less labor participation, lower productivity, and an increasing sense of panic from systems that relied on male participation while simultaneously discouraging it. For decades, men were told to leave. Now that they have, the same voices are demanding they come back. But men are not returning to a game where the rules are stacked against them. Instead, men are building quiet, controlled lives. They are focusing on personal health, financial stability, and hobbies that bring satisfaction rather than validation. They are reducing expenses, avoiding unnecessary obligations, and prioritizing peace over status. In many ways, men are rediscovering themselves outside of constant societal judgment. They are living simply, comfortably, and intentionally. This shift has exposed something deeper. For a long time, men shielded others from the consequences of bad decisions. Men absorbed risk. Men paid the price. Men worked longer hours, took on dangerous jobs, and carried responsibility silently. Now that protection has been withdrawn, reality is asserting itself. Rising costs, unstable systems, and declining safety are no longer abstract issues. They are lived experiences. You can see it everywhere. Online conversations filled with frustration, public admissions of exhaustion, increasing demands for support that is no longer forthcoming. The same society that insisted men were unnecessary is discovering how difficult life becomes without them. And the most important part of this moment is that men are not angry in the way that people expected. They are not rioting. They are not begging. They are simply opting out. And this is what men walking away actually looks like. It is not loud. It is not chaotic. It is calm, deliberate, and final. Men are choosing to conserve their energy. They are choosing to invest in themselves rather than systems that extract without appreciation. They are choosing peace over conflict. And here is the part that cannot be reversed easily. Once men experience life without constant pressure, once they realize they do not need external validation to be content, it is almost impossible to pull them back with guilt or shame. The old tactics do not work anymore. Accusations fall flat. Moral lectures are ignored. Men have already run the cost benefit analysis. Society is now facing the consequences of decades of ideological excess. Hey guys, in a world pushing you to own nothing and be happy, crypto is your key to survival. Join Angry's Crypto Academy to master buying, selling, and trading crypto. Make huge profits and safeguard your wealth. Plus, discover the one crypto virtually no one is talking about, poised to create new millionaires in the upcoming bull run. The link is in the description of the video below. Go check it out now. Not because men lashed out, but because they listened. And when men walk away, everything that depended on their participation begins to strain. Infrastructure weakens, security thins, economies wobble, families disappear. These are not opinions, they are measurable outcomes. The uncomfortable truth is that modern civilization was built on a partnership between men and women, not on competition or resentment. When that partnership was replaced with hostility and suspicion, the foundation cracked. Now the cracks are visible, and this is only the beginning. What we are seeing now is the early stage of a long adjustment. Systems built on the assumption of endless male labor, endless male sacrifice, and endless male compliance are discovering that assumptions are not guarantees. Men are no longer sacrificing themselves for narratives that do not value them. This does not mean men hate society. It means they no longer feel responsible for saving it at their own expense. They are choosing self preservation. They are choosing autonomy. They are choosing a life that does not demand they apologize for existing. The question society now faces is not how to shame men back into participation. That approach has failed completely. The real question is whether society is capable of rebuilding mutual respect, accountability, and again balance. Because without men, the machine does not run. And without cooperation, no amount of rhetoric can replace reality. Picking up where we left off, it is important to understand that this shift did not happen overnight, and it did not happen because men were incapable of adapting. Men adapted for decades. They adapted in schools where boys were treated as problems to be managed rather than minds to be developed. They adapted in workplaces where ambition was quietly discouraged and assertiveness was rebranded as aggression. They adapted in relationships where expectations were infinite but appreciation was conditional. Every step of the way, men were told that if they just changed a little more, if they softened a little further, if they apologized a little longer, harmony would return. But harmony never came. The demands increased, the accusations escalated, and the rewards disappeared entirely. What many people fail to grasp is that men do not leave lightly. Men are builders by nature. They prefer to fix rather than abandon. Walking away is not a first instinct for most men, it is a last resort. When men finally disengage, it is usually after years of evidence that their presence is neither wanted nor valued. This is why the current withdrawal feels so sudden to observers who are not paying attention. From the male perspective, this has been a long time coming. As men began stepping back, the social response followed a predictable pattern. First came denial, insisting that nothing meaningful was happening. Then came minimization, claiming that the men leaving were unimportant or replaceable. After that came moral pressure, attempting to guilt men back into participation by framing withdrawal as selfish or immature. None of it worked because men were not acting emotionally, they were acting logically. They were responding to incentives, outcomes, and risk. In modern dating, for example, the risk has become disproportionate to the reward. Legal systems heavily penalize men for relationship failure, regardless of circumstances. Social norms increasingly treat male interest as suspicious and male commitment as something owed rather than earned. Men observed this and adjusted accordingly. They stopped pursuing marriage. They stopped investing emotionally in systems where the downside was severe and the upside uncertain. This was not bitterness, it was self defense. The same pattern emerged in employment. Men noticed that loyalty was no longer reciprocated. Long hours and dedication did not guarantee stability. Entire careers could be erased by economic shifts or public accusations. Meanwhile, expectations remain constant: provide, perform, produce, pay. Men began opting out of traditional career ladders, choosing instead to work less, earn enough, and preserve their time and sanity. Productivity dropped not because men became lazy, but because the social contract collapsed. What makes this moment unique is that men are not replacing these systems with new ones. They are choosing simplicity. They are reducing complexity rather than adding to it. A smaller apartment instead of a large house. A reliable vehicle instead of a luxury one. Fewer possessions, fewer obligations, less noise. This minimalist approach is not about deprivation, it is about control. When you control your needs, you control your exposure to pressure. There is also a psychological component that is rarely acknowledged. Men are experiencing relief. The constant background stress of performance expectations, social judgment, and financial responsibility has lifted for many. Without the demand to prove themselves endlessly, men are rediscovering curiosity, creativity, and calm. Hobbies that once seemed indulgent now feel essential. Fitness, learning, craftsmanship, and personal projects take priority. Life becomes quieter, but also richer. This quiet shift is deeply unsettling to systems built on constant male output. Governments depend on tax revenue generated by male labor. Corporations depend on male productivity. Entire industries depend on men accepting difficult, dangerous, or undesirable work. When men stop volunteering for these roles, the shortage becomes impossible to ignore. No amount of messaging can replace physical labor, risk tolerance, and endurance. The response so far has been telling. Rather than addressing the root causes, many institutions are attempting to rebrand the same expectations with softer language. They speak of inclusion, balance, and shared responsibility, but the underlying structure remains unchanged. Men are still expected to give more than they receive. They are still expected to absorb risk without recognition. And men see this clearly now. This is why appeals for men to return are failing. Men are not opposed to contribution, they are opposed to exploitation. They are not rejecting responsibility, they are rejecting asymmetry. Until systems offer fairness instead of obligation, men will continue to remain distant. It is also worth addressing the idea that men walking away is driven by resentment toward women. That narrative misses the point entirely. This is not about punishment, it is about boundaries. Men are not withdrawing to harm anyone, they are withdrawing to protect themselves. The absence of men is not an act of aggression, it is an act of self respect. At the same time, many women are experiencing confusion and frustration. They were promised independence without trade offs. They were told that traditional partnership was optional, even unnecessary. Now they are encountering the reality that independence without cooperation is exhausting. Economic pressure, emotional isolation, and social instability take a toll. The expectation that men would always be available as a fallback option has proven incorrect. This moment could have been avoided if honest conversations had taken place years ago, if male contributions had been acknowledged rather than dismissed, if accountability had been shared instead of deflected. Instead, society chose ideological comfort over practical balance. The result is a growing divide that cannot be bridged with slogans. What is especially striking is how little drama accompanies this change from the male side. There are no mass protests, no demands for sympathy, no pleas for understanding. Men are simply living their lives quietly. That silence is interpreted by some as apathy, but it is more accurately described as resolution. Men have made their decision and moved on. As this continues, secondary effects will become more visible. Fewer men in trades means slower repairs and higher costs. Fewer men in transportation means supply delays. Fewer men in security means increased vulnerability. These are not ideological issues, they are mechanical ones. Systems require inputs to function. Remove enough inputs and output declines. The long term consequences extend even further. Without stable families, future generations shrink. Without mentorship, skills disappear. Without shared responsibility, trust erodes. None of this happens dramatically. It happens gradually, then suddenly. History is full of examples of societies that underestimated the importance of social cohesion until it was gone. Men understand this instinctively, which is why many have chosen to step aside rather than prop up structures they no longer believe in. They are no longer willing to sacrifice themselves to delay an inevitable reckoning. They are choosing to weather the storm individually rather than drown collectively. This choice has been misunderstood as disengagement from reality. In truth, it is the opposite. Men are engaging with reality directly without filters or narratives. They are adjusting their lives to match conditions rather than expectations. This is why observable reality matters more than promises. Promises have failed too many times. The phrase men walking away captures this dynamic perfectly. It is not a movement with leaders or slogans, it is a shared conclusion reached independently by millions of men observing the same patterns. When independent observers reach the same conclusion, it is usually because the data is compelling. This also explains why attempts to shame men back into participation are ineffective. Shame relies on social pressure. Social pressure only works when individuals value acceptance within that group. Men who have already stepped away no longer seek approval from the systems criticizing them. The leverage is gone. Looking forward, there are only a few possible paths. One is continued denial, which will accelerate decline. Another is coercion, which will increase resistance. The only viable path is reform, and reform requires humility. It requires acknowledging mistakes. It requires restoring respect for male contribution without conditions or qualifiers. Whether society is capable of that remains an open question. What is clear is that men will not return to old roles under old terms. That chapter is closed. Any future cooperation must be built on mutual respect, shared accountability, and realistic expectations. Until then, men will continue to live smaller, quieter, more controlled lives. They will continue to prioritize peace over participation. They will continue to invest in themselves rather than systems that view them as resources rather than people. And as uncomfortable as it may be for some to hear, this is not a crisis men are trying to solve. It is a crisis men have stepped away from. The responsibility now lies with the systems that pushed them out. We are not watching the collapse of men. We are watching the withdrawal of men from structures that no longer serve them. The distinction matters because collapse implies weakness, withdrawal implies strength. This moment will define the next generation. Either society recalibrates and rebuilds cooperation on honest terms, or it continues to fragment under the weight of its own contradictions. Men have already made their choice. They chose clarity over chaos, peace over pressure, and self preservation over sacrifice. And that is why this conversation matters, because ignoring it does not stop it. Pretending it is temporary does not reverse it. The reality is already here. As this reality settles in, another layer becomes impossible to ignore, which is how quickly trust has eroded between individuals and the systems meant to organize society. Trust is the invisible infrastructure that keeps everything functioning. It allows people to cooperate without constant enforcement. It allows effort to feel worthwhile. Once trust breaks, no amount of policy or persuasion can fully replace it. Men trusted that if they worked hard, played by the rules, and contributed to the collective good, They would be treated fairly and with dignity. Over time, that trust was chipped away piece by piece. Each double standard, each accusation without due process, each shifting expectation reinforced the same lesson that the rules were no longer stable and the outcomes were no longer predictable. Men adapted by becoming more cautious, more reserved, and eventually more detached. This detachment is often misread as indifference, but it is more accurately a strategic withdrawal. When the environment becomes hostile, organisms conserve energy. They reduce exposure. They seek shelter. Men have done exactly that, not out of spite, but out of necessity. They learned that visibility came with risk, that participation invited scrutiny, and that silence offered safety. This has had profound effects on communication between men and women. Conversations that once happened naturally are now avoided altogether. Men have learned that even neutral interaction can be misinterpreted, recorded, or reframed. The cost of misunderstanding has become too high. As a result, many men choose distance over dialogue. This is not because they lack interest in connection, but because connection has become legally and socially dangerous. What is rarely acknowledged is how exhausting this constant vigilance has been. For years, men navigated social environments as if walking through a minefield, aware that a single misstep could have lasting consequences. When they finally stepped away from that environment, the relief was immediate. The absence of tension allowed clarity to return. Without constant self monitoring, men regained mental space. They slept better. They focused more deeply. They felt lighter. This mental clarity has reinforced the decision to stay disengaged. Once you experience life without constant stress, it becomes difficult to justify returning to it. Men are no longer motivated by external approval, they are motivated by internal stability. That shift alone changes everything. Meanwhile, institutions continue to operate as if nothing fundamental has changed. Policies are written assuming a steady supply of male labor, compliance, and participation. Economic forecasts rely on growth models that no longer reflect reality. Cultural messaging still assumes that men will respond to criticism by trying harder. That assumption is outdated. Men are no longer seeking permission to exist, they are choosing how and where to invest themselves. This mismatch between institutional expectations and individual behavior is creating friction across every layer of society. Employers struggle to fill positions that require endurance, risk, or long hours. Governments struggle to fund programs as tax bases shrink. Communities struggle to maintain cohesion as fewer people feel invested in shared outcomes. Each problem is treated as isolated, but they are all symptoms of the same underlying issue: disengagement. Disengagement is not rebellion, it is resignation. Men did not overthrow the system, they simply stopped holding it up. That distinction is important because it means traditional responses are ineffective. There is nothing to suppress, nothing to punish, nothing to negotiate with. Men are not making demands, they are opting out. And this opt out mentality is also changing how men view success. Traditional markers like career advancement, public recognition, and social status hold less appeal. Instead, success is measured by autonomy, peace, and control over time. A modest income paired with low stress is preferred over high earnings paired with constant pressure. Men are redefining what a good life looks like, and it does not align with the metrics institutions use. This redefinition has ripple effects. Consumption decreases, debt becomes less attractive, risk tolerance shifts. Men are no longer willing to gamble their futures on promises of fulfillment that may never materialize. They are choosing certainty over aspiration. That choice stabilizes the individual, but destabilizes systems built on ambition and growth. There's also a generational component to this shift. Younger men are observing the experiences of older men and adjusting their expectations early. They are less interested in climbing ladders that appear unstable. They are less inclined to form attachments that carry asymmetric risk. They are learning from observation rather than instruction. This means the trend is likely to accelerate rather than reverse. Attempts to re engage men through messaging alone will fail because messaging addresses perception, not structure. Men do not need to be convinced that participation is virtuous. They need evidence that participation is fair. Without structural change, words are meaningless. Structural change requires acknowledging uncomfortable truths. It requires admitting that systems have benefited from male sacrifice while devaluing male well being. It requires recognizing that equality without accountability creates imbalance. It requires abandoning narratives that paint one group as inherently flawed and another as inherently virtuous. These admissions are politically difficult, which is why they have been avoided. But avoidance carries its own cost. The longer reform is delayed, the more entrenched disengagement becomes. Habits form, lifestyles solidify, social networks shrink. Once men build lives that function without institutional support, the incentive to re engage diminishes further. This is why some observers are beginning to express concern, though often indirectly. Articles about labor shortages, declining birth rates, and social fragmentation are becoming more common. Yet these discussions rarely address the root cause. They treat symptoms while ignoring the disease. The disease is broken reciprocity. Societies function when contributions are acknowledged and burdens are shared. When one group is expected to give as endlessly while being criticized for doing so, withdrawal becomes rational. Men did not invent this logic, they followed it. There is also a moral dimension that deserves attention. For years, Masubame men were told that they had an obligation to serve society regardless of how society treated them. Duty was framed as unconditional. That framing stripped men of moral agency. They were expected to comply, not consent. Walking away is a reclaiming of agency. It is a statement that obligation without respect is not obligation at all. This reclaiming of agency has empowered men in unexpected ways. They are more selective about commitments, more intentional about relationships, more protective of their time. They are learning to say no without apology. That skill alone reshapes identity. Critics often frame this as selfishness, but that interpretation misunderstands the difference between selfishness and self preservation. Selfishness takes at the expense of others. Self preservation simply refuses to be taken from. Men are not extracting value, they are retaining it. As men retain their energy, they redirect it inward. Self improvement replaces self sacrifice. Education becomes self directed rather than credential driven. Physical fitness becomes personal rather than performative. Creativity becomes a private pursuit rather than a social currency. Life slows down, but depth increases. And this inward focus also reduces susceptibility to manipulation. Men who are content require fewer incentives. They are harder to pressure. They are less reactive. That calmness is often mistaken for passivity, but it is actually resilience. Resilience, however, does not rebuild systems. It allows individuals to endure their decline. This is the paradox society now faces. Men are stable individually while collective structures weaken. From a systemic perspective, this is dangerous. From an individual perspective, it is optimal. And bridging this gap would require a fundamental reimagining of social contracts. It would require asking what men are willing to contribute and under what conditions, rather than assuming unlimited availability. It would require listening rather than lecturing. It would require humility rather than authority. Whether such a shift is possible remains uncertain. Cultural inertia is powerful. Admitting error is difficult for institutions built on moral certainty, yet reality does not negotiate. Trends continue regardless of acknowledgement. And what is clear is that the current trajectory cannot sustain itself indefinitely. Either cooperation is rebuilt on new terms or fragmentation deepens. Men will continue to adapt either way. They have already proven that. This adaptation is not glamorous. It does not make headlines. It happens quietly in daily decisions, fewer social outings, fewer commitments, more time alone, more time thinking. These small choices accumulate into large patterns. As these patterns solidify, reversing them becomes increasingly difficult. Trust, once broken, takes generations to restore. Respect, once lost, must be earned anew. Men are open to fairness, but they are no longer naive. The future will belong to those who understand this reality and adjust accordingly. Those who cling to outdated assumptions will struggle. The world has changed, not because men demanded it, but because they responded to what they were shown. This is the truth many are unwilling to face. Men did not abandon society. Society abandoned the conditions that made male participation worthwhile. Men simply noticed, and that awareness cannot be undone. Once seen, it cannot be unseen. Once experienced, it cannot be forgotten. Men walking away are not waiting for permission to return. They are waiting for reality to change. Until then, they will continue forward on their own terms, quietly, deliberately, and without regret. What makes this moment even more complex is that many of the men who have walked away did everything they were told to do. They followed the advice that was presented as responsible and mature. They pursued education. They worked hard. They tried to be emotionally available. They attempted to meet expectations that constantly shifted. When the promised outcomes failed to materialize, they did not immediately rebel. They questioned themselves first. They assumed they had made mistakes. They tried again and again. Over time, a pattern emerged that could not be ignored. Effort was not leading to stability. Compliance was not leading to respect. Participation was not leading to fulfillment. This realization created a quiet but powerful internal shift. Men stopped internalizing blame for outcomes that were structurally baked in. They began separating what was within their control from what was not. This distinction changed everything. Once men recognized that many of the risks they were carrying were imposed rather than chosen, they began removing themselves from situations where those risks were unavoidable. This was not an emotional reaction, it was an optimization problem, and men solved it. A key part of this optimization involved reassessing relationships. For a long time, men were encouraged to believe that personal sacrifice was proof of character, that enduring imbalance was noble, and that dissatisfaction was simply the price of commitment. That framing worked only as long as men believed the sacrifice was reciprocated in some form. When reciprocity disappeared, the logic collapsed. Men began asking a question that had previously been discouraged. What am I actually getting out of this? The answers were often uncomfortable. This questioning did not come from hostility, it came from exhaustion. Many men realized they were spending their energy maintaining dynamics that offered little in return beyond obligation. When they stepped back, something surprising happened. Very few people noticed. The lack of response confirmed what many men already suspected, that their value had been assumed rather than appreciated. That confirmation hardened resolve. At the same time, men observed how quickly narratives shifted once their absence became inconvenient. Suddenly, discussions about male well being resurfaced. Articles appeared about loneliness, mental health, and the importance of male role models. These conversations, while overdue, often felt reactive rather than sincere. Men noticed that concern emerged only after withdrawal, not before. This timing undermined trust further. Trust, once fractured, does not respond well to performative gestures. Men are highly sensitive to inconsistency between words and actions. They have seen enough campaigns and slogans to recognize when change is cosmetic. As a result, many men simply ignore these renewed appeals. They have learned that patience is often exploited. Another important aspect of the shift is how men now relate to authority. Institutions that once commanded respect through tradition and perceived legitimacy now face skepticism. Men no longer assume that authority equates to wisdom or fairness. They evaluate institutions the same way they evaluate personal relationships, by outcomes. If an institution consistently produces negative results for them, they disengage. This pragmatic approach leaves little room for nostalgia. This reevaluation of authority extends into cultural narratives as well. Stories that frame men as problems to be managed or resources to be extracted no longer resonate. Men are increasingly selective about the media they consume and the conversations they engage in. They gravitate toward content that reflects observable reality rather than ideological framing. This has created parallel cultural spaces where men speak candidly without fear of misinterpretation. These spaces are often misunderstood by outsiders because they lack the emotional volatility typically associated with grievance movements. Instead of outrage, there is analysis. Instead of demands, there is detachment. Men are not organizing to overthrow anything. They are sharing information, comparing experiences, and adjusting their lives accordingly. This decentralized nature makes the shift difficult to counter or control. It also makes it resilient. There is no leader to discredit, no organization to dismantle, no single message to suppress. Each man arrives at the same conclusion independently based on his own experiences. That convergence is what gives the phenomenon its strength. As men step away from traditional expectations, they are also redefining masculinity on their own terms. Without constant external judgment, masculinity becomes less performative and more functional. Strength is no longer about dominance or display. It is about self control, competence, and reliability. Emotional regulation replaces emotional exhibition. Integrity replaces validation seeking. This internalized masculinity is quieter but more durable. It does not require applause. It does not depend on approval. It exists whether it is recognized or not. For many men, this is the first time they have been allowed to define themselves without interference. That freedom is deeply reinforcing, and freedom, however, comes with trade offs. As men disengage, social fragmentation increases. Communities lose cohesion. Shared rituals disappear. Intergenerational transmission of values weakens. These losses are real, and men are not unaware of them. But awareness does not obligate participation. Men understand that holding together a system that no longer serves them requires ongoing sacrifice with diminishing returns. This is where the conversation often becomes uncomfortable because it forces a choice between collective stability and individual well being. For decades, men were expected to choose the collective without question. Now they are choosing themselves. That choice is not inherently immoral. It reflects a recalibration of priorities. The long term consequences of this recalibration will be complex. Some systems will adapt, others will fail, new arrangements will emerge. History suggests that periods of transition are rarely smooth. What matters is whether lessons are learned or repeated. One lesson that stands out clearly is that demonizing a foundational group has consequences. Societies cannot function while telling their primary contributors that they are liabilities. Respect is not a luxury, it is a prerequisite for cooperation. Without it, participation becomes transactional at best and avoidant at worst. Another lesson is that incentives matter more than ideology. People respond to environments and not intentions. If the environment punishes effort, effort declines. If it punishes visibility, visibility disappears. Men responded exactly as one would expect given the conditions they faced. There is also a lesson about balance. Sustainable systems distribute burdens and rewards in ways that feel fair. When imbalance becomes chronic, disengagement follows. Men walking away is not an anomaly, it is a predictable response to sustained imbalance. Some argue that technological advancement will compensate for reduced male participation. Automation, they claim, will replace labor. This belief underestimates the complexity of real world systems. Technology can supplement human effort, but it cannot replace accountability, adaptability, and judgment. Machines do not maintain themselves. Systems still require people willing to take responsibility. Others argue that new cultural norms will eventually re engage men. This assumes that men are simply confused or resistant to change. In reality, men have already changed. They have adapted faster than most institutions. The question is whether institutions are willing to adapt in return. Adaptation would require more than superficial gestures. It would require revisiting legal frameworks that disproportionately penalize men. It would require cultural narratives that acknowledge male contribution without qualifiers. It would require workplaces that reward effort fairly and transparently. It would require relationships built on mutual responsibility rather than entitlement. And none of these changes are impossible. They are simply uncomfortable. They require admitting that past approaches were flawed. They require relinquishing moral certainty. They require listening to men without immediately reframing their concerns. Whether society is capable of this level of introspection remains uncertain. What is certain is that time will continue moving forward. Men will continue building lives that minimize exposure to instability. Younger generations will internalize these strategies early. The longer reform is delayed, the more permanent the shift becomes. It is also worth noting that not all men experience this transition the same way. Some feel relief immediately. Others feel grief for the connections they hope to build. Walking away does not mean indifference to loss. It means accepting loss rather than continually fighting against it. That acceptance can be painful, but it is also grounding. And this grounding leads to a different relationship with reality. Men stop fantasizing about what could be and start focusing on what is. They stop negotiating with expectations and start setting boundaries. They stop seeking permission to prioritize their own well being. These changes compound over time. As this mindset spreads, it will influence everything from housing markets to consumer behavior to political engagement. Men who are disengaged from traditional systems are less likely to vote, less likely to take on debt, less likely to support expansive policies. This will reshape governance, whether leaders acknowledge it or not. The irony is that many of these outcomes could have been prevented through simple recognition and respect. Men did not ask for special treatment, they asked not to be treated as problems. When that request was ignored, withdrawal became rational. At this stage, the question is no longer why men are walking away. That answer is clear. The question is what happens next. Does society adapt, or does it continue insisting that nothing fundamental has changed? The answer will determine the shape of the future. Men are no longer waiting for validation. They are no longer waiting for permission. They are no longer waiting for things to improve. They are building lives that work regardless of what happens next. That self reliance is both a strength and a signal. It signals that men are prepared for prolonged instability. It signals that they no longer assume systems will protect them. It signals that they are willing to stand alone if necessary. These signals should not be ignored. Because once a critical mass of people adopts this mindset, reassembling collective structures becomes exponentially harder. Cooperation requires trust. Trust requires consistency. Consistency requires accountability. Without these elements, fragmentation accelerates. This is the crossroads we are approaching. The path forward will not be decided by rhetoric, but by actions. Men have already acted. The question is whether the rest of society will respond in kind or continue speaking into a void. At this stage of the discussion, it becomes necessary to confront a truth that many prefer to avoid, which is that societies do not collapse because of loud rebellions as often as they collapse because of quiet disengagement. History tends to focus on dramatic moments, protests, revolutions, and visible conflict, but far more damage is done when the people who keep systems functioning simply stop participating. Roads are not repaired, power grids are not maintained, logistics slow down, public order weakens. None of this happens overnight, and that is why it is often dismissed until it is too late. Men understand this dynamic intuitively because they have spent their lives operating the machinery of society. They know what it takes to keep things running. They also know what happens when effort is withdrawn. This knowledge has shaped their response. Rather than shouting warnings, many men have chosen silence. Silence is not ignorance. Silence is a signal that no one is listening anyway. What is particularly striking is that this disengagement has occurred without a unifying ideology. There is no manifesto, no central doctrine, no formal organization. That absence makes the phenomenon harder to dismiss as extremism or fringe behavior. It is simply the outcome of millions of individual cost benefit analyses converging on the same conclusion. When that happens, it is rarely accidental. One of the most overlooked factors in the shift is how men process failure. Men are taught from a young age that failure is theirs to own. If something does not work, they are expected to improve, adapt, or endure. This mindset served society well when effort was rewarded proportionally. But when men repeatedly applied effort and still faced negative outcomes, the lesson changed. The lesson became that some systems are not fixable from within. Once that realization sets in, persistence becomes irrational. This is why the language of perseverance no longer resonates with many men. Telling men to try harder in environments that punish effort feels disconnected from reality. Men are not afraid of hard work. They are tired of futile work. The difference matters. Another element shaping this withdrawal is how risk is distributed. In many modern systems, men carry a disproportionate share of downside risk. Legal risk, financial risk, reputational risk, and physical risk are all concentrated heavily on male shoulders. Meanwhile, the corresponding authority and appreciation have diminished. Men noticed this imbalance long before it was publicly acknowledged. They adjusted accordingly. Risk aversion is often framed as weakness, but in unstable systems, it is intelligence. Men are reducing exposure not because they lack courage, but because they recognize that courage without protection becomes recklessness. Choosing not to enter hazardous environments is not cowardice, it is prudence. This prudence is reshaping how men approach every aspect of life. Relationships are evaluated for long term stability rather than short term excitement. Careers are chosen for sustainability rather than prestige. Social circles are kept small and trustworthy rather than expansive and performative. These changes reflect a deeper shift toward resilience over recognition. Resilience, however, does not generate the same visible outputs that growth oriented systems rely on. Resilient individuals consume less, borrow less, and demand less. They are harder to motivate through incentives that rely on fear or aspiration. From an institutional perspective, resilient men are inconvenient. From an individual perspective, they are secure. This security reduces susceptibility to narratives designed to provoke guilt or urgency. Men who have simplified their lives are less reactive to economic pressure. Rising costs affect them less. Social criticism carries less weight. This insulation further reinforces disengagement. At the same time, many men are rediscovering forms of meaning that exist outside institutional approval. Craftsmanship, physical competence, mentorship within small trusted groups, and personal mastery provide fulfillment without external validation. These pursuits may seem modest, but they offer something modern systems often fail to deliver: a direct connection between effort and outcome. That connection is deeply satisfying. When men see a tangible result of their work, whether it is a repaired machine, a strengthened body, or a skill mastered, it restores a sense of agency. Agency is the opposite of alienation. Systems that remove agency inadvertently push people away. This brings us to another uncomfortable point. Alienation has been treated as an emotional issue rather than a structural one. Men are told to talk about their feelings while the conditions causing those feelings remain unchanged. While emotional expression has value, it does not compensate for systemic imbalance. Men do not disengage because they fail to communicate. They disengage because communication does not lead to change. This is why repeated calls for dialogue ring hollow. Dialogue without accountability becomes performance. Men have learned to distinguish between conversations that lead to action and conversations that exist to diffuse criticism. Once that distinction is made, patience wears thin. There is also a cultural contradiction at play. Society simultaneously demands that men be emotionally open and emotionally restrained. They are encouraged to express vulnerability, but penalized when that vulnerability conflicts with expectations of strength. This double bind creates confusion and mistrust. Many men resolve it by opting out entirely. Silence becomes simpler than navigating contradictions. As more men choose silence, public discourse becomes skewed. Male perspectives disappear from mainstream conversations, leaving policies and narratives increasingly disconnected from the experiences of half the population. This feedback loop accelerates disengagement. When people do not see themselves represented, they withdraw further. This withdrawal has consequences for governance as well. Democracies rely on participation and legitimacy. When large segments of the population disengage, trust in institutions erodes. Voter turnout declines. Civic involvement weakens. Decision making becomes concentrated among narrower groups, amplifying polarization. These effects are already visible. Some attempt to frame this disengagement as apathy, but that framing misunderstands motivation. Apathy implies indifference. What we are seeing is not indifference, it is selective investment. Men are choosing where to place their energy, and public systems are increasingly low on that list. The irony is that many of these systems still depend on male compliance even as they dismiss male concerns. This contradiction cannot be sustained indefinitely. Either dependency is acknowledged and addressed, or breakdown accelerates. Another dimension worth examining is how this shift affects intergenerational relationships. Traditionally, older men pass down skills, values, and knowledge through mentorship and example. As men disengage from public life, these transmission channels weaken. Younger generations lose access to practical wisdom. This loss compounds over time, creating skill gaps that cannot be filled quickly. Men are aware of this cost, but they also recognize that mentorship requires trust and mutual respect. Teaching is an investment. When environments become hostile or dismissive, men protect their knowledge by keeping it within trusted circles. This privatization of expertise further fragments society. Fragmentation, once underway, is difficult to reverse. People retreat into smaller units that feel safe and predictable. These units function well internally, but lack broader cohesion. Coordination becomes harder. Shared goals disappear. Society becomes a collection of parallel lives rather than a cooperative whole. This outcome is not inevitable, But avoiding it requires intentional change. It requires acknowledging that men are not merely participants in society, but pillars of it. It requires rebuilding trust through consistent, measurable actions rather than symbolic gestures. One of the most damaging assumptions has been that men will always return because they always have. History, however, shows that once groups disengage at scale, re engagement requires significant reform. The idea that men can be shamed or persuaded back into old roles ignores the fundamental shift that has already occurred. Men have tasted autonomy. They have experienced life with fewer obligations imposed by external systems. That experience recalibrates expectations permanently. Any attempt to re engage men must compete with the peace they have found on their own. This does not mean men reject cooperation entirely. It means cooperation must offer value that outweighs its costs. Respect, fairness, and shared accountability are not luxuries, they are prerequisites. As things stand, many men are prepared to live indefinitely without institutional approval. They have adapted to uncertainty, they have reduced dependency, they have accepted solitude as a viable state rather than a failure. This acceptance is powerful. Powerful because it removes leverage. Systems that rely on fear, obligation, or scarcity lose effectiveness when individuals are self sufficient. This shift redistributes power away from institutions and toward individuals. That redistribution is subtle but transformative. It also explains why there is growing tension beneath the surface. Institutions sense the loss of control. They respond with increased messaging, increased regulation, increased pressure. These responses often backfire, reinforcing the very disengagement they aim to prevent. Men are watching these reactions carefully. Each overreach confirms their assessment. Each attempt to coerce participation strengthens resolve. Men are not interested in confrontation, they are interested in stability. When stability is threatened, withdrawal feels safer than engagement. This cycle will continue until something breaks or something changes. Either systems adapt to retain participation or they decay under the weight of lost trust. Men have already adapted. They are no longer waiting. What remains uncertain is how long systems can function under these conditions. Decline is not linear. It accelerates as thresholds are crossed. A shortage becomes a crisis. A delay becomes a failure. A gap becomes a collapse. These tipping points are difficult to predict, but easy to recognize in hindsight. Men understand this as well. That understanding informs their decision to focus on personal resilience rather than collective rescue. They are not trying to stop the tide, they are building boats. This metaphor captures the essence of men walking away. It is not abandonment out of spite, it is preparation. Preparation for a future that may be less stable, less predictable, and less forgiving. Men are positioning themselves to endure rather than to lead systems they no longer trust. Leadership requires legitimacy. Legitimacy requires trust. Trust requires reciprocity. That chain has been broken. Rebuilding it will take time, humility, and tangible reform. Until then, men will continue doing what they have been doing quietly, deliberately, and without apology. They will work enough to sustain themselves. They will avoid unnecessary risk. They will cultivate skills that increase independence. They will form small, reliable networks. They will detach from narratives that do not align with reality. This is not a temporary phase, it is an adaptation to conditions. Adaptations persist as long as conditions remain unchanged. The burden of change does not lie with those who adapted, it lies with those who created the conditions in the first place. And that is the reality we are living in now. For decades, society relied on an assumption that men would always absorb pressure, that they would work longer, tolerate more, risk more, and complain less. This assumption became embedded in policy, culture, and interpersonal expectations. Over time, it stopped being an assumption and became a dependency. The moment men stopped playing that role without question, the dependency was exposed. What we are seeing now is the shock of that exposure. It is tempting for many to frame this as a moral failing, to say that men have abandoned responsibility or lost their sense of duty. But this framing ignores a basic principle of human behavior. Responsibility without authority, accountability, or respect eventually collapses. Duty that flows only in one direction is not duty, it is exploitation. Men did not reject responsibility, they rejected asymmetry. When men realized that the system did not intend to correct that asymmetry, they adjusted their behavior. They lowered their expectations, they reduced their commitments, they simplified their lives. This was not a rejection of adulthood, it was a refinement of it. Adulthood is not about suffering endlessly for approval. It is about making choices that align effort with outcome. One of the most significant consequences of this shift is how it has changed men's relationship with time. For much of modern history, men traded time for security. Long hours were justified by the promise of stability, family, and purpose. As those promises weakened, the trade lost its appeal. Men began reclaiming their time. They chose flexibility over hierarchy, presence over prestige. Time, once reclaimed, became the most valuable resource. This reclaiming of time also altered how men relate to pressure. When time is scarce, pressure feels urgent. When time is controlled, pressure loses its power. Men who have structured their lives around minimal obligations are far less reactive to external demands. They do not rush to meet expectations that offer no return. They evaluate calmly and respond selectively. This calmness has been misinterpreted as disengagement from reality, when in fact, it is deeper engagement with reality. Men are no longer distracted by narratives about who they should be. They are focused on what actually works. That focus is grounded, pragmatic, and durable. It also explains why attempts to reignite old incentives have failed. Appeals to status, validation, or guilt fall flat when men have learned to live without them. You cannot motivate someone with rewards they no longer desire. You cannot threaten someone who has already accepted loss. This is the position many men now occupy. From the outside, this may look like indifference. From the inside, it feels like alignment. Life becomes simpler when expectations are clear and self directed. When men are no longer pulled in conflicting directions, they are not trying to satisfy incompatible demands. They are living within boundaries they control. This does not mean men are incapable of care, cooperation, or contribution. It means those qualities are now conditional on fairness. Men are willing to build, but they will not be used. They are willing to protect, but they will not be blamed for doing so. They are willing to lead, but they will not be undermined for leading. These are not extreme demands. They are basic conditions for sustainable participation. Another aspect that deserves attention is how this shift has reframed the concept of success. For a long time, success was defined externally. Titles, income, visibility, and approval served as markers. Men pursued these markers because they were told they led to fulfillment. Many discovered that they did not. In stepping away, men began defining success internally. Peace became more valuable than praise, stability more valuable than ambition, control more valuable than recognition. This internal definition of success cannot be easily disrupted. It does not depend on market cycles, public opinion, or institutional approval. It depends on personal alignment. That makes it resilient in uncertain times. As instability increases, resilience becomes more important than growth. This shift also affects how men view the future. Rather than planning decades ahead within rigid systems, men are planning flexibly. They are building skills rather than credentials, savings rather than leverage, mobility rather than attachment. These strategies are adaptive responses to unpredictability. They are not pessimistic, they are realistic. Realism, however, can feel threatening to systems built on optimism and projection. When people stop believing in long term promises, institutions struggle to mobilize effort. This creates tension between planners and participants. Men are no longer willing to sacrifice present well being for uncertain future rewards. That calculus has changed permanently. It is also important to acknowledge that this transition has emotional dimensions that are often overlooked. Walking away involves loss of imagined futures, loss of roles that once provided identity, loss of connection to shared narratives. Men have felt these losses deeply, even if they do not express them publicly. Choosing peace does not erase grief. It simply prevents grief from becoming self destructive. In many cases, men have processed this grief privately and moved forward. They have accepted that some paths are closed and chosen others deliberately. Acceptance is not resignation, it is clarity. It allows energy to be redirected rather than wasted. As this clarity spreads, it reshapes communities. Smaller, tighter networks replace broad, impersonal ones. Trust becomes localized. Cooperation becomes selective. These changes make life manageable at the individual level, but they reduce the scale at which coordination occurs. Large systems struggle when participation becomes fragmented. This fragmentation is not driven by hostility, it is driven by caution. When trust is scarce, people retreat to what they can verify. Men trust what they can see, measure, and control. They invest accordingly. If there is a warning embedded in this moment, it is this: societies cannot function indefinitely without the willing participation of men, not coerced participation, not guilt driven participation, willing participation. That willingness depends on respect, reciprocity, and realism. Remove those elements, and withdrawal becomes inevitable. At the same time, men cannot be forced back into roles they have outgrown. The experiences they have had cannot be erased. The lessons they have learned cannot be unlearned. Any attempt to rebuild cooperation must start from where men are now, not where institutions wish they were. This requires a level of honesty that has been missing from public discourse. It requires admitting that certain narratives caused harm. It requires acknowledging that balance was lost. It requires recognizing that men are not interchangeable units of labor or support, but individuals with agency. Whether this honesty emerges remains uncertain. Institutions are often slow to adapt, especially when adaptation requires self critique. But reality applies pressure regardless of acknowledgement. Trends continue, outcomes accumulate. What is clear is that men have already adapted. They are living in the future that current conditions have created. That future is quieter, leaner, and more self directed. It is not utopian, it is simply workable enough that men are not rushing to change it. And that brings us to the central point of this entire discussion. Men did not set out to change society, they set out to survive it. The changes we are seeing are a byproduct of that survival strategy. They reflect intelligence, not malice, adaptation, not abandonment. As this video comes to a close, the question is not whether men will return to old patterns. That answer is already clear. The question is whether society will adapt to the reality men are living in now. Whether respect will replace rhetoric. Whether fairness will replace assumption. Whether cooperation will be rebuilt on honest terms. I want to hear from you. What did you think about what we discussed? Do you agree with this assessment? Have you seen these shifts in your own life or among people you know? Leave a comment and share your thoughts, because this conversation matters and it needs to be grounded in real experiences. Like the video if you like it. Don't forget to subscribe. And if you like the video, share the video. And just remember that all roads lead to MWA, men walking away, and cheers.
Nothing, nothing, nothing. crypto. Nothing can compare. Nothing says you care like crypto. Oh, nothing can compare to crypto.